Hello, thank you for joining us for panel 6 of the Narrating the Holodomor conference, a conference organized by the Holodomor Research Education Consortium at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, University of Alberta. This panel is entitled Recent Scholarship on Bystanders to Atrocity. And it's a little different than in the other panels with more of a comparative approach. Our first speaker is Professor Dennis Klein. I have the honor to introduce him now. Dr. Dennis B. Klein is Kean University Professor of History and Director of the Jewish Studies Program and the Master of Arts in Holocaust and Genocide Studies program. Before joining the university in 1996, he served as founding director of the Anti-Defamation League's Brown Center for Holocaust Studies and its Hidden Child Foundation, as well as editor-in-chief of ADL's Dimensions, a journal of Holocaust studies. He is the author or editor of 7 books, including Jewish Origins of the Psychoanalytic Movement, Hidden History of the Kovno Ghetto, The Genocidal Mind, Survivor Transitional Narratives and Societies Emerging from Conflict, The Aftermath of Atrocity. He is currently at work on a book about bystander incrimination in the late 20th century. Dr. Klein, you have the floor, and you have you have 20 minutes, but we have some flexibility as we have 2 speakers on this panel.
Okay, Marta, thank you so very much for that introduction. And yes, I do want to share PowerPoint, but just to say by way of intro that I really look forward to the comparative nature of our problem here. And I'll go into what the problem is, but I do think the question of bystanders has become global, applies to atrocity broadly, and certainly to the subject of this conference, as well as to the subject of my research, which is in Holocaust studies. And in fact, I want to therefore share with you some of the work that I've done in Holocaust studies in order to help clarify some questions that folks who are scholars about the Holodomor might begin to explore for themselves. So let me go ahead and therefore try to see if I can share this. Yeah, let me first of all share this screen. See where I am here. I'm gonna have to open this up again, I'm afraid. Sorry about this delay. There we go. Okay, very good. Let me just go from get the full screen on here. Okay, everybody able to see this?
Yes.
Very good. Let's continue then with what I wanted to share with you. I'm going to begin with a couple of images from the Holodomor and begin to make some observations before I get into my argument. And so some of this might be familiar to those of you who are working on these problems. And this is the unfortunate image, as we know. But my interest here, for the purposes of this presentation, is on the 2 folks in the foreground. That is to say, those who are walking by. We don't really know what's going on in their minds, of course, and I'm not going to begin to speculate. All that I'm just pointing out here is the existence of folks who, to a certain point in history, were not paid much attention to. It was what we unfortunately are seeing in the background that becomes the main part of the story and should remain the main part of the story. Nonetheless, victims and perpetrators, as important as they are central to the story, we have brought into this conversation over the last, let's say, 80 years, the so-called third, that is to say, the onlookers, and what the relationships are between onlookers and the victims. So, yeah, this another scene as we are altogether too familiar with. But again, I want to draw our attention to those to the left and to the right of the image in the center, the individual in the center here. Now we can see that there's literally an onlooker to the right here of this image, paying some attention to this, and maybe even to his friend as well. And so we know there's a tension, and we know there might even be concern, and we can begin to therefore interrogate what might be happening in the minds of those who are looking on. But we can only at this stage, at least of my presentation, only speculate. This is a scene from Tulsa, Oklahoma, migrating to a different part of the world in 1921. In that year, an incident occurred that ignited a response by the largely white community to the existence of a very prosperous and successful Black neighborhood, sometimes referred to as Black Wall Street. In this particular town, many of those who were in positions of leadership belonged to the Ku Klux Klan. At one point, the decision was made, ignited by a minor incident, and that's all that it took, to begin to destroy the Black community. And we see evidence of the destruction in the background. Again, what I want to draw our attention to, however, are those in the foreground. And these are not only folks who are no doubt aware that something is occurring in their neighborhood, but they seem to be perfectly indifferent to, or to begin to use the criminal terminology here, negligent about what is happening in the background. I mean, we can see that, in fact, there are some people that are dressed rather nicely, that they're going about their business wherever their destinations were. They're not frightened, they're not concerned, they're not turning the other way of adjusting their destination. They seem to be walking towards it. It seems like it's not a non-incident, let's put it that way, to those who are referring to at this point now as bystanders. Migrating again over now to Europe, and this is a scene from the era of the Nazi regime. It is something that historians have documented many times, forcing Jews in the city to scrub the sidewalk needlessly. But the point, of course, here is power as well as humiliation. And again, we're drawn in the light of this presentation to the background. That is to say, those who are looking on, and there's quite a number of folks, in fact, who are doing so. We don't really see much energy in the background here. Certainly interest, yeah, maybe even curiosity. We can see to the right here, there's a gentleman that seems to be quite interested in what is occurring at this point. It's the extent of, let's call it, involvement. We may even speculate there are those who are encouraging this kind of humiliating behavior. We don't know that. What we can see here, and therefore what we do know, is non-intervention, right? They are bystanders, they're onlookers, passers-by, or whatever phrase that we might choose to describe this kind of behavior. I'm not the first to say, and historians have now noted, that the bystanders are nonetheless, whether they like it or not, playing a role, because they are making into the scene, right, a sensation, a spectacle, and therefore reinforcing the humiliation that those in the foreground are experiencing. And it happens to be true, and we know this, that the perpetrators, such as these folks standing in the middle of this image, in fact, are using bystanders to further the humiliation of those here, in this case, in the foreground. Or another incident from the Holocaust period in which German soldiers, as we can see from this caption, are forcing someone who happens to be Jewish to cut off the beard of another Jew that's in violation of Jewish law. So yes, this is indeed a violation, and it cuts deeply for those who are observant of this ritual. But again, it's the bystanders that I want to pay attention to. And they seem to be rather enjoying this moment. At least that's my interpretation. There is one gentleman to the right that's looking at the camera, so posing for the picture to be sure that he, in this case, is part of what is occurring at this point. Or the woman to the right of this image holding her young child, looking on with, I would say interest at the very least, if not possibly some enjoyment. At least we can begin to read their faces, if nothing else. And for the most part, we are seeing, such as the soldiers to the left and some of the bystanders, that this is not only a point of curiosity, it is truly a point of some enjoyment, if not entertainment. From the victim's perspective, and I want to turn to the victim's perspective shortly, we can see one example of this in the caption in green from one survivor, Vladimir Yankelevich, who wrote that abandonment was one of the most frightful aspects of the ordeal. So what is going on in the mind of the individual whose beard is being cut at this point? No doubt there is humiliation, certainly powerlessness, and a sense of abandonment. And we need to talk about what that means in a moment. This is an image from Kristallnacht that occurred in Germany in November 10 and 11, 1938, in which there was an assault on retail stores or department stores, as we can see in the background here, owned by Jews. And there was an attempt to attack or to be aggression towards Jews in 38. This is 5 years into the regime. It's the first expression of aggression on this scale in Germany. And so we can see the broken glass. In fact, Kristallnacht is sometimes translated as the night of the broken glass. And there are those who are interested in that, for sure, looking in on what the destruction was about. But we're looking at the bystanders in the foreground. The two in the center of this image don't seem to care so much what is happening behind them, at least at this point of the picture. More interested in whatever is happening across the street. And there are others, right, who are walking by. This is another incident during Kristallnacht, when the authorities set afire to synagogues that were located in cities across Germany. And while the destruction has been also documented, as we can see here, it's again in the foreground that we are observing those who are looking on with curiosity for sure, but looking on without, and here we now need to pay some attention to the lack of action, the passivity, the inaction, and for whatever motivations might be involved. Also, going back to the scene of the broken glass, and in the foreground to the left, two folks who seem to be rather enjoying themselves. And so now I want to begin to turn our attention to victims. We have a great deal of scholarship about bystander behavior ever since the phenomenon became noticeable back beginning with the Holocaust period, or possibly before. And this is why I believe this is relevant for this particular conference. We can understand why scholars are trying to explain the behavior of those who stand by. I sometimes read the effort at explaining their inaction as a form of excuse. And here I've want to make the statement rather strongly, and of course open to anybody's comments as always. But I believe that scholars are trying very hard to explain why those who might have done something to make a difference chose not to. Clearly, one reason for that is that the situation is risky. Why sacrifice yet another life, their own in this case, if the consequences are so dire? It could be that they felt helpless, and some of the earlier images that we looked at around Kristallnacht is true. What could even a body of onlookers have done with the authorities and their weapons so visible and so assertive? And so there's all sorts of reasons why we can understand why bystanders do not get involved. I call this conditional, right? There are reasons why we don't take action. But from the victim's perspective, it's unconditional. That is to say, they're the ones that are going through hell. And therefore, what can possibly be going through their minds, should they still be alive, is, all those who are looking on, why wouldn't you get involved? Yeah, yes, it's risky for you, but think about what I'm going through. It's not a matter of risk. I've already crossed that line. And so victims are going to have a very different take on bystander behavior. The first thing that we need to note is that they really brought the world's attention to bystanders and possibly their responsibilities. In fact, I want to go so far as to say that if it weren't for the victim's voice, we would not be talking so much about bystanders today. So though I love scholars, for sure, as I happen to consider myself one of those, nonetheless, it's really the victim that have made the subject one that we are really concerned about and talking about today. This is from what we're looking at the moment, a passage from Simon Wiesenthal's memoir, in German known as Die Sonnenblume, or in English, The Sunflower, in which he wrote in 1969. And I will talk about the significance of that date in just a moment. And here he writes in this memoir, our fathers had crept out of the confines of the ghetto, that is to say in the 18th century, into the open world. They had worked hard and done all they could to be recognized by their fellow creatures, he adds, but it was all in vain. The reason that I wanted to make a point of this particular passage is that historically, and therefore contextually, we need to understand that the victims of the Nazi era, who were Jewish, have a very important trajectory that we need to keep in mind, and I think this passage helps us sum up. Jews, when they were emancipated in the 18th century from ghetto confinement, believed that they were offered opportunities in which they can therefore become integrated into European society. It was on this basis that they had come to rely on their neighbors, not Jewish, because now they're part of the same civic society, at least by law. And so there's good reason to have expected that neighbors would come to the assistance of Jews whenever they needed help. And this is what Simon Wiesenthal is actually referring to here. We worked hard. We wanted to be recognized by our neighbors. And it turned out that their expectations, and that's an important part of the story here, were betrayed. Another form of violation. And something, therefore, no doubt, that's going through the minds of those who were Jewish, who were victimized by the Nazis during this period of time. And so we see, therefore, this reference, written by one who escaped from the Warsaw Ghetto in Poland, a Jew, who was wondering what was going on with those who are now in power, the Poles who were in power in their government in exile, since now Poland was occupied at this point strictly by the Germans in 1944. And he, Tadeusz Robecki, writes to the government in exile a very important consideration. Where was it, the Polish government in exile, which happens to be, by the way, in London? During the 4.5 years of occupation, why didn't it order the Poles back in 1939 to help Jews hide from the German murderers? Why did they keep silence? Why did they let, and why are they still letting us to be destroyed here on the Aryan side? The Polish people betrayed 3.5 million Jews. This is a fact that will be discussed in history. A prescient, of course, comment, because here we are talking about this very phenomenon. An important figure during this period, a leader of the Berlin Jewish community, Joachim Prinz, was one of the first to make the point about the abandonment of neighbors or bystanders back in 1935, just 2 years in to the Nazi regime. He wrote then, in English translation, "It is the fate of the Jew to be without neighbor. The Jews of the small towns who live at the market square without neighbors, who kids go to school without the neighbors' kids, they feel the isolation. And in the cohabitation of humans, it might be the hardest lot anyone can befall. We wouldn't feel all this with so much pain if it weren't for the feeling that we once had neighbors." Again, an important observation. We once, or at least they thought they once had neighbors. There's been a lot written since the Holocaust period by survivors about whether or not they truly did have neighbors, but nonetheless, they thought they actually did at the time. The other point I want to make about this passage is Prince's reference here that it may be the hardest lot anyone can befall. That's an astonishing observation, because we have always assumed, and for good reason, that the hardest lot would be their victimization. But in this case, no. It also goes deep into the experience of survivors when they realize that the neighbors they thought they once had are taking no action to come to their aid. So almost by chance, Prince at this point migrates to the United States. He establishes residency in New Jersey, my home state, and Newark in particular, a very significant synagogue that he becomes a rabbi of and plays an important role. And as a result, he became quite interested in the civil rights movement in the United States from the mid-50s to the mid-60s. Martin Luther King took notice of Prince and invited him to join him at a significant march in Washington, D.C. on August 28th, 1963. And he actually gave Joachim Prince the prime of place, the first to speak to the crowd of some 250,000 people. And he says in this particular passage from the speech, something that he had said in 1935, some 30 years before. "When I was a rabbi of the Jewish community in Berlin under the Hitler regime, the most important thing that I learned is that bigotry and hatred are not the most urgent problem. The most urgent, the most disgraceful, the most shameful, and the most tragic problem is silence. A great people which had created a great civilization had become a nation of onlookers." There's reference to Germany. America must not become a nation of onlookers. America must not remain silent. The date again, 1963, because that becomes the significant decade in which those survivors themselves experienced this story 20 years before. It was only in the 60s that this had become a phenomenon. Notice of the bystander, the so-called third, and the question, why the silence? That became considerably important during this decade. King himself, that I referred to, makes a rather significant point about silence. We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the hateful words and the actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people. The silence, as King said elsewhere, of our friends. So I want to therefore wrap this up by talking about an incident that many of you might well be familiar with. And there's a good reason why we became familiar with this one case. This is the case of the murder of one resident in Queens, New York, specifically in Kew Gardens, in which she was murdered by an assailant who returned to her actually twice. And this story became rather sensational itself, specifically as it was reported in the New York Times. And so on the date of, or the day after the murder, we can see exactly what the story was. It was yet a story, another story about crime, street crime in New York City. Turns out that in the years 1963, 64, and 65, street crime was rather frequent. And so it's yet, as we can see, another story on the streets of Kew Gardens, New York. There is a reference here, I highlight this in yellow, to the neighbors who are awakened by the screams, but that's the only reference made in this story. So when the story first broke, it was about what you and I would expect, the crime. But as it unfolded 2 weeks later, the story was reframed. And here I want to give, I guess, credit to the then Metropolitan City editor, Abraham Rosenthal. He decided, and I'm told that he in fact wrote the first 2 paragraphs of this story, even though the byline is by Martin Gansberg. And the story, as the headline indicates, is about those who saw what was occurring and did nothing, and then is framed in the subheadline by the word apathy. So now he's really beginning to speculate about motivation and makes a rather big deal elsewhere. He wrote a book shortly in that just a few months after this incident that I'll refer to briefly. He makes a rather big deal that the urban environment in the industrial world has turned cold and indifferent. That sociologists refer to this as anomie, as a condition of urban life. So in this particular story, that, by the way, appeared on the front page of the New York Times, though below the fold, but nonetheless, the attention that the reading public was giving to this particular story. And all I want to do for the sake of time is to again read the line highlighted in yellow, that not one person telephoned the police. This is the story, that there were those who stood by and did nothing. And so I want to end with a reference here to the civil rights movement. And we can again see the familiar now image. Here is a Black citizen in Little Rock, Arkansas, who with others, the famous Little Rock Nine, were trying to break the color line and to enter a school that to that point was exclusively for white citizens. This, of course, became a story, as we can imagine, as the entire civil rights movement no doubt was. And here I want to again draw our attention to the background. There are those who are looking on, possibly with contempt, I wouldn't be surprised, but certainly inaction. But here's how I want to end this presentation. This is a passage that the individual in the foreground, Elizabeth Eckford, recalled some years later. When I sat there, September 4th, 1957, I felt terribly alone, abandoned. I was encouraged by 2 reporters, however, that were here. I was surrounded behind me by local reporters who took it upon themselves to be a human barrier between me and the angry demonstrators. And that's the point I want to end with here. Bystanders, of course, would, by the very name, deserve the reputation that they get. But it's true. With our understanding of bystanders, we're interested not only in why some people stand by, but what about folks who actually take some action? Now here, we don't see the reporters turning against those who are looking on. That would be an impossible situation. But according to Eckford, the person who now we have some understanding of what she was thinking about, she was, though feeling abandoned, also feeling grateful that the reporters formed this barrier, their right intervention that seemed to help her in this case. So it doesn't require heroic behavior. There's all sorts of possible bystander behavior that can begin to turn the story from accessories to the crime to folks that are actually offering assistance. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Klein. I'd like now to introduce Nicholas Kupensky. Whoops, I just minimized. One moment, please. Dr. Nick Kupensky is an assistant professor at the United States Air Force Academy, where he teaches Russian and foreign area studies. He received his PhD in Slavic languages and literatures from Yale University, taught comparative humanities at Bucknell University, and was an Andrew W. Mellon postdoctoral fellow at Bowdoin College. His publications on Russian, Ukrainian, and Rusin modernism have appeared in Slovo, Muzejny Vysnik, Ukraina Moderna, Nationalities Papers, and Harvard Ukrainian Studies. He also regularly reviews new titles for H Ukraine. Nick, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Marta. And because I work for the United States Air Force Academy, I have to say that the comments that I'm going to make today are my own and don't represent those of the United States government or Department of Defense. So, and I don't have a PowerPoint today. I'm just going to make my presentation like this. So, in his memoir, Assignment in Utopia, the American journalist Eugene Lyons reflected on his time spent reporting in the Soviet Union, and specifically on the years when he was in Soviet Ukraine. And in these moments in his memoir, he speaks about why he didn't bear witness to the Holodomor. As a correspondent for United Press International, Lyons was one of the many foreign journalists who traveled around Soviet Ukraine in the fall of 1932 to participate in the opening ceremonies of the 5-year plan's industrial objects. And like many of these foreign journalists, he saw some of the first signs of famine in the Ukrainian countryside. After partaking in a number of industrial tours, he admits that we, meaning the journalists, talked of little else than the hunger and the terror about which we did not write or wrote in misty circumlocutions. However, he goes on to describe how you look at the new factories, the collectivized acreage, the figures for tractor building close up in the here and now. Then you step back a few generations or centuries and look at the human cost of these achievements through the telescope of posterity. Naturally, these atrocities, I'm adding the word atrocities, naturally, these atrocities seem small and unimportant at that distance. So Lyons' metaphor of this telescope of posterity is a telling one. For his memoir contrasts the two different forms of perception, his memoir contrasts two different forms of perception with their own distinct temporal horizons. And this first form of perception that he describes is the ability to see a tragedy in the here and now and adequately morally respond to it. But there's this other temporal horizon, which is to imagine the future effects of this tragedy and to conclude that there's going to be some hypothetical future goods which will outweigh the horrors of the present. And we know that the Anglophone visitors to the Soviet Union saw ample visual evidence of the Holodomor, including food shortages in urban areas, starving peasants along railway lines, and corpses in the countryside. But the majority of contemporary representations of the 5-year plan portray it as an unqualified success, which raises this fundamental question of why were some individuals capable of seeing the Holodomor in the here and now, but others were blind to it. The genocide scholar Israel Charney has proposed 6 classifications for why individuals reject evidence of mass killings. The first, the malevolent bigotry of perpetrators, is typically characteristic of state actors. The second, the self-serving opportunism of careerists who often materially benefit from, the second is the self-serving opportunism of careerists who often materially benefit from ignoring the atrocities. The third are what he calls innocent denials and disavowals that believe that society is fundamentally just, and so, I just can't imagine that such a terrible thing is happening. His fourth category, what he calls definitionalism, is used by those who deny that the deaths should be referred to as a genocide. His fifth category, nationalistic hubris, motivates those who either don't know or don't care about the suffering of who they perceive to be as lesser or minor or non-historical peoples. And his final classification, what he calls basic human shallowness, comes from what he says is the dulling or depletion of the genuine sense of tragedy, or what Dennis has just described as ennemi, in this case of Catherine Genovese. And all of these categories, I'm going to suggest, apply to the Anglophone bystanders of the Holodomor, many of whom with their own eyes saw its horrors, but could not or did not respond in the here and now. And so what I would like to do today is propose a loose typology of Holodomor bystanders by adapting Charney's classifications to the modes of writing or the modes of narration about the conditions in Soviet Ukraine in 1922 and 1933. Indeed, and I'm going to slightly modify Charney's categories. Many were defiant of the evidence of the Holodomor, usually due to political or ideological factors. Others disbelieved what they saw because they were lied to by the authorities and naively accepted these stories. Some deceived themselves. They were blinded by, hypnotized by, addicted to, or fetishized the Industrial Revolution, or were convinced that the 5-year plan must, at the end of the day, have noble aims. Lyons was not the only bystander to minimize the significance of the famine, either by refusing to use the term itself or by insisting that the future would bring greater good. Many dismissed the suffering of Ukrainians as a people or the peasantry as a class. And others simply consciously or unconsciously repressed what they saw. So the first category I'll talk about is this category of the defiant or defiance. And this first classification describes those who knew that the Holodomor was taking place and flatly refused to acknowledge that mass death was occurring. Typically, this narrative mode refers to the true believers in the Soviet experiment. And its most infamous member is obviously the New York Times correspondent Walter Duranty, who not only denied the existence of the famine, but interviewed and other journalists' ability to report on it. And much has been written about Duranty, which I won't repeat here. But there's a second individual who I view as being part of this category as well, who is Anna Louise Strong, who is the editor of the Moscow News. And while she didn't have nearly the same cultural capital as Duranty, she also frequently employed the language of a true believer and employed the language of the state. Others, such as the Nation's correspondent Louis Fisher, use discourse of fellow travelers, which is to say those who hoped that the promise of an egalitarian society would come true, but with time and often with political expediency, would criticize the Soviet Union and express personal contrition for their complicity in concealing the famine. And Charney notes that what's remarkable about this category of the defiant is that their denials are generally accepted by other nations as a cover that reports of the alleged killings are still inconclusive. And as Rega Manch has recently shown in the spring issue of Harvard Ukrainian Studies, Duranji's audience with Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his ability to shape the discourse about the famine, in part, helped create an environment in which the recognition of the Soviet Union in 1933 took place without America raising the famine as an issue. A second classification, disbelief, describes individuals who knew of the existence of the Holodomor, but didn't acknowledge it out of naivete or self-interest. And here we find the so-called useful idiots who believed Soviet explanations of the famine. And this narrative mode of the naive, or often and more cynically, the faux naive, typically includes George Bernard Shaw, who sardonically quipped that I didn't see a single undernourished person in Ukraine, or the sociologists Sidney and Beatrice Webb, who thought that the famine was inevitable and that the Soviet government could hardly have acted otherwise. Other discourse is inflected by vanity or the inflated sense of self-importance, which usually comes from being supported or praised by the Soviet state. And the work of Fortune magazine's star photographer Margaret Burke-White operates in this mode. Convinced by her Soviet colleagues that she was the only photographer capable of photographing the 5-year plan, and in many cases would be the first to have access and to shoot the country's most important transformations, Burke-White developed what she unironically called a panchromatic lust for dynamic images of the plan, and represented herself as the girl that has been climbing every derrick in Russia. While those like Burke-White were singularly focused on their tasks, many saw evidence of the Holodomor, but claimed to be unable to recognize it as such in real time. Indeed, the metaphors used by what I'll call the deceived, this third category being the deceived, give the impression that these bystanders were stripped of their sensorial, cognitive, and linguistic agency. Some said that they were blinded by the magnificence of the industrial colossi, and they were blind to seeing evidence of the famine right alongside them. Malcolm Muggeridge of the Manchester Guardian described how foreign bystanders moved through Ukraine, seeing and yet not seeing the horrors of the famine. Others felt hypnotized by the beauty of technology, like the Hungarian writer Arthur Koestler. He remembered that the train stations were overrun by begging peasants with swollen hands and feet, but the journalists visiting the 5-year plan's industrial landscapes traveled in a state of hypnosis. Fisher also admitted feeling what he called the hypnotic effect of the Soviet Industrial Revolution and its ability on and his ability to take into account the true human tragedy left in its wake. Yet others were addicted to the feeling of awe while watching the Ukrainian countryside allegedly modernize or fetishize the modernity of newly launched power plants and factories. Koestler described how the industrial colossi attracted the addict of the Soviet myth and assumed the fetish character of the lock from the hair of the beloved. Elsewhere, one finds many bystanders shifting into a mode expressing that human nature must be good. Hence, the Holodomor could not be made by man. And one of the individuals who enters into this discourse is the businessman and photographer Whiting Williams, who admitted that it was difficult to believe that there was starvation according to plan. This is just too inhuman, he said. Many bystanders deployed rhetoric from all of these modes, and a typical rhetorical turn among the most malevolent, and who I'll call the minimizers, was to squabble over the term famine itself. That is, these individuals minimized the famine by calling it a food shortage. And much has been made much has been written about Duranty's infamous headline, "Russians hungry, but not starving," which falls into this category that Charney calls definitionalism or minimization. It's hunger, but it's not starvation. Duranty also categorically avoids the term famine, which he wrote was mostly bunk in a letter to H.R. Knickerbocker. And we find Anna Louise Strong also exclusively using the term food shortages rather than famine, which semantically minimizes the impact of what is happening. Others minimize the famine by emphasizing its future benefits. And this is the anecdote that I started with. Lyons's image of the telescope of posterity operates within this mode. Fisher also wondered, wouldn't you forgo butter for Dnieperstroy? Wouldn't you sacrifice your food to create this better world? Likewise, the journalist Maurice Hindis relayed the conversation with the Ukrainian communist who uses the same formulation. And Hindis writes, or this Ukrainian communist tells Hindis, in time, peasants would have everything. How could they help it with Magnitogorsk and Kuznetsk and Dnieperstroy and all the other vast building projects coming to a finish? But this peasant, he has no eyes to see. And all because he had absorbed so little of this new culture. And here in this quote from Hindis, we could clearly see the battle for a singular temporal horizon. For the communist scoffs at the peasants' narrow-minded refusal to see the future. The peasant is too bound up in seeing the present that he can't see the future. He has no eyes to see it, he says. Anna Louise Strong even emphasizes that the famine was necessary to defeat Hitler, quoting the Stalin issue of Life magazine to argue that whatever the cost of farm collectivization, these large farm units made whatever the cost of farm collectivization, these large farm units made possible the use of machinery, which doubled output and released millions of workers for industry. Without these workers working in industry, Russia could not have built the industry that turned out the munitions that stopped the German army. So the explicit, moving on to this fifth category, which is dismissal, we find that the explicit or implicit ethno-national chauvinism of English and American writers often meant that many dismissed the humanity of Ukrainians as a people or the peasants as a class. And most of the accounts of Anglophone bystanders flatten ethnic differences. To most of the Americans and the British journalists, all the people that they're encountering with are Russian. So they don't even really see the ethnic differences. And so instead, they prefer to view the conflict in the countryside as one between progressive workers and backwards peasants. Strong is especially resistant to recognizing their suffering. And she writes, I don't blame the government for taking some grain. Why should efficient workers die for inefficient peasants who couldn't get in the grain? Louis Fisher's reaction was the same. The peasants brought the calamity upon themselves. I saw grain which the peasants had left on the fields. It rotted. It was their winter food. Then those same peasants starved. Yet many who we could reasonably assume saw evidence of the famine left no written accounts of it, a mode that we could cautiously call the repressed, whether conscious or unconscious. And I've recently argued that Margaret Burke-White should be viewed in this earlier category of being a self-serving careerist. But there are moments when I have my doubts, because what's troublesome is that she doesn't acknowledge, neither publicly nor privately, that she ever saw evidence of the famine, with the exception of a minor speech in her hometown where she mentions, as an aside, that the people of Russia appeared very tired and shabby in 1932. And Charney conceptualizes this a bit differently. And Charney sees in this indifference the dulling and depletion of the genuine sense of tragedy and moral outrage, which he says is the result of the routinization, desensitization, and banalization of genocide. In other words, these accounts often, with respect to the Holodomor, these accounts often rely on the starving peasant in Russia trope, which all too often is deployed and assumed. The starving peasant in Russia is assumed to just be part of the landscape. So to conclude, one of the most common features of Holodomor denials by bystanders is this very disruption of perception and temporality that Lyons described. The bystanders are too narrowly focused on meeting their deadlines, too broadly focused on the future of the Soviet state. They're too narrowly focused on the industrial objects of the plan, too broadly focused on the promise of a bright, radiant, modern future. They're too narrowly focused on the meaning of famine, too broadly focused on the centuries of underdevelopment in the Russian imperial provinces. Few foreigners who saw the Holodomor had the eyes to see it, to take this term from the Hindus quotes. Few foreigners saw it for what it was. And for this reason, few felt the responsibility to tell its story. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nick. And now we will turn to Daria Mattingly, who will be our discussant for today. And I should mention, at any point, if you want to ask questions, you can do it through the chat function. Dr. Daria Mattingly is Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at University of Cambridge in the UK, where she recently received her doctorate degree. Daria completed her MA in History at University of Bristol and studied philosophy at Kyiv-Shevchenko University in Ukraine. In her doctoral dissertation, Daria focused on the rank-and-file perpetrators of the Holodomor and their representation in cultural memory. And I'll also say that I've known Daria for a while, and she was instrumental as a research assistant to the writing of Anne Applebaum's Red Famine as well. Daria, take it, please.
Thank you, Marta, for kind introduction. It was a pleasure to be Anne's assistant, really. And thank you, Dennis and Nick, for sharing your incredible and in many ways illuminating research. I learned a great deal myself. And Dennis for bringing comparative perspective on such a vital issue as the role of bystanders, or rather silence in the Holodomor. I'm sure it adds to our understanding of the famine and the words of Joachim Prinz, that the most tragic problem is silence, not the bigotry or hatred, like he said. I think it hits very close home in case of the Holodomor too. And I would also, as you were discussing it, and I didn't have a chance, well, I didn't have your article, and I'm looking forward to when it is finished to reading it, but I was immediately comparing that to the situation with the Holodomor, and thinking about the initial resistance to collectivization, sometimes armed, though disorganized and not very well, there was no central, so it was very chaotic. So state mass violence was enabled not only by the silence in case of the Holodomor, but also by the preceding violence. And I would go as far as the civil war in case of Ukraine. So the events of 1919, the Great Peasant Revolt in Ukraine, and the fact that peasants were still, when you brought the issue of emancipation of the persecuted group, I was immediately thinking that peasants in Russian Empire in general and in Ukraine as well, they were still partially emancipated even by law. We knew that they were not entitled to the passports. And yesterday it was discussed by two speakers about how Ukrainian peasants differed, but still they were disenfranchised. So your mentioning of emancipation, imagined and practical, emancipation hits close home in case of the Holodomor too. But there are many more parallels to be drawn from your comparative perspective, and I look forward to your article. With regards to bystanders, and this is where I was interested in how you would conceptualize and elaborate the category of bystanders. I'm sure you would agree that categories of perpetrators and victims, they do have analytical value to historians. What does that mean? I wonder if the distinction put forward by Kenneth Pike between etic and amic can help us here, etic being related to the observers categories and amic to the actors categories. So I would not deny that victim and perpetrator, these categories supersede both etic and amic, because one is persecuted, the other is persecuting. But when it comes to silence and bystanders, I immediately think that amic categories have a role in history. Certainly, they can have a role for individuals. So we have to think about how, not presentism, but bystanders, how can they work as analytical categories for us? Some of them certainly fall into the category of people that you were discussing of implicated subjects, I would say, because I'm just still under the influence of Michael Rothberg's book on implicated subjects, because even in case of the Holodomor, urban city dwellers, they were sometimes not benefiting, but they were implicated in the regime that instigated mass violence. So sometimes they would be a silent, because it would be silent approval, or sometimes it would be silence because of the fear, and sometimes silent approval, or as what Nick was discussing, denial, disbelief, and reluctance or repressed. So there are many things at play here. So I'm not quite sure what it would be in case of the Holodomor. And I found Nick's telescope of posterity incredible. In fact, I thought, well, it explains a lot in my research as well when I was thinking beyond the category of perpetrators. This dismissal of victims as collateral cost of modernization project. And it immediately, when Nick was citing these bystanders, this acceptance of the epistemological authority and rationality of the topmost perpetrators of the Kremlin, of the Soviet project, it dehumanizes the victims. And this stance is made possible also, in my view, by exoticism, which Dennis was actually breaking by bringing this comparative perspective. But what Nick is describing, it is exactly that. When I know, Nick, you didn't want to go into much detail about Walter Duranty, but Duranty himself in his writing said that Soviet peasants are not like American peasants. They are backward, and you just said that too. So this is subtle discourse of, I don't want to call it Orientalism, but certainly for many observers, victims were distant, not only ethnically, but I think more culturally, and in time and space, and certainly, for example, for revisionist historians today, they still are. And I was immediately thinking of who else articulated that Orientalism, and thought obviously about Kopelev, a dissident who lived in Ukraine at the time and participated in the famine as perpetrator. He articulated this distance aptly in his memoirs, when he said that he could not relate to peasants. They were primitive, they smelt differently, they looked differently, and they were certainly not as cultured as Germans, for example. It also what I found in your article, and I enjoyed it, that how they articulate, they just, bystanders, they absolve the state leadership, who were fully informed of the mountain famine conditions, of responsibility for this collateral cost and measures that they pursued and policies. Obviously, politicians are responsible for the policies they are pursuing and millions of starving people. And this perspective also could be explained by, now I'm bringing politics today, by Fiona Hill, when she obviously writes about Putin, but she says this statist narrative of Soviet history, when this perspective of the leadership of the state from the, what are the interests of the state, obviously, in which people are for the state or state-centered narrative. That's the narrative these bystanders are constructing. So the narrative of collectivization of the famine, it's narrated from the perspective of the state. So people are for the state, their resources. And obviously priorities of regime come first. And according to such logic, the loss of human lives is justified, not analyzed. And I think that's the narrative they are constructing ultimately. And obviously they are dismissed as collateral cost of modernization. Why fellow travelers? Of course, the Soviet Union as an unprecedented project of a socialist state seemed to be a beacon, especially amidst, if we put it in the context of the 1930s in particular, a positive modern state aiming for social justice, universal literacy, and scientific progress, and they just eliminated malaria. They educate the masses, something that the state in the Victorian England certainly didn't do on such a scale, or I don't know, comparable. Yes, Benito Mussolini also eliminated malaria, but it's not the same, obviously. Soviet state ideology rationalized state intervention and therefore cannot be explained without comparative analysis. And I think this is where your two papers talk to each other, because when Dennis compares to other cases of mass violence, you look into more detail at this particular case studies. And yes, and also modernization, when they described it as modernization project, I found it's fascinating that they seem not to mention that the aims are achieved with pre-modern state. Pre-modern methods, ancien regime, really, just nothing changed. But this is how we see, even in medieval history, we see borrowing from the previous period anyway. So that's this continuity in Russian history and Russian Empire history. So my question to you, Nick, would be about the categories. I understand it's still a work in progress, so I'm not criticizing here. But for example, in the second category, when you discuss disbelief, I would separate it, naivete and self-interest. I think they're contradicting categories, because if there is self-interest, it's not disbelief, because it's what another dissident, Grigorenko, said, it was convenient for them to claim they were true believers. And in my work, in my research, I found that it's quite problematic this when bystanders or perpetrators call themselves true believers, because when you read, for example, Kopelev in particular, when you read his testimony in tandem with archival documents or people who worked alongside with him, we see he was no true believer at all. He was collaborating with secret services, he was denouncing people like on a whim, and he's quite a controversial character, especially on the ground when he worked on the ground. So these categories are very interesting, but I would not crystallize them, but I would work maybe, I don't know, make borders between them more distinct. So I'm sure you can belong to a few categories. So yeah. Here. So I wasn't quite convinced by the second category, and I think they were echoing each other later on, but I'd like to know what you think about that. Yes, and it's a tricky question. I mean, the topic itself about bystanders, because where do you draw the line, bystander? I mean, if we apply the veil of ignorance, if we were bystanders themselves, it's much like charity, seems to start at home. And that's why I started with exoticism or Orientalism. And I think you can bring that in as well. I think you call it nationalism, hubris of nationalism. And I think this way, this Orientalism can be brought in. Yes, those are my comments. Thank you. But thank you for both papers. I've really enjoyed them. Not papers, but presentation. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Daria. Dennis, would you like to start with responding?
Yeah, good. Thank you. Daria, those are really thoughtful comments, off the cuff, no less. Yeah, so well done and thank you. And it is true, by the way, I think Nick's presentation and mine are in conversation. So that's not a bad deal. It's nice to get to know a new friend. Let me just comment more directly on some of your observations. There's no question that the term bystander is up for grabs. How do we define it? It's a definitional problem, though. As Nick said, Charney tries to deal with that directly. The best defense that I have in response to a very good and important observation on your part is, again, the question of perspective, because it depends who you're talking to. So I would say that if you're talking to let's say, folks on the street, minding their own business, so to speak, then we can come up with all sorts of important explanations about whether, in fact, they're being irresponsible, whether there is responsibility, whether they're even noticing possibly what's occurring around them for reasons that Nick explored. It's difficult to know. But I really believe, in some respects, that we can simplify that question by looking at it from the perspective of victims, because there, as I was saying, it's unconditional. There is no good reason why somebody who's in proximate relationship to the crime should not or cannot, in some measure, as my last slide indicated, there are all sorts of possibilities here to affect the situation, hopefully protect the victim in that case. So I would say we can simplify that question from the victim's perspective. Everybody who is proximate to the crime is responsible for taking some measure in order to intervene or make the difference. One quick example of that is, as we know, why are we today talking about the George Floyd incident? Why did it capture our international attention the way it did and continues to be a substance of conversation? It's because there were those who were standing by and had decided to take out their phones and to record what was happening, and then it went viral. It's a perfect example, it seems to me, of what someone could have ignored and would have been perfectly understandable why somebody might well have ignored what was going on at the time. These folks did not. They recorded it. And that was an act, I would say, of some intervention. It's, of course, impossible to know what the victim, George Floyd, was going through at the time. I mean, let's be clear, his only focus there was just staying alive. But it's quite conceivable that that would have been a moment of intervention. And I believe, in fact, it turned out to have been. So that's the perspective that I would therefore adopt.
We can now turn to the questions of our audience. John Setchka first thanks both presenters for the presentations and has a question for Nick. How do we integrate people like Fred Beal, who at first was drawn to the Soviet Union and the industrial drive, but eventually did see the famine and attempted to speak out about it? He challenges our ability to see people through only one lens, and he offers a unique perspective that demonstrates that some people did overcome blindness that others did not. Thanks.
Thanks a lot for the question, John. And I'll respond to it by actually also responding to Daria's questions, and this question of how I understand these categories, because one of the things that
I'm sorry, Nick, did I not give you?
yeah, no,
Okay, well,
no, that's entirely all right. So one of the things that I sort of said at the outset, and one of the things that Daria said, which is exactly correct, is that this is a work in progress, and these are sort of loose modes of trying to classify and categorize, which for me are forms of discourse within these accounts. As a being trained as a Russian literary historian, let's say, I'm my mode as a scholar is to work on literature. The thing that I'm interested in is how these individuals represent the famine, and how in their discourse they use certain persistent images, certain persistent tropes, and certain rhetorical justifications, and make certain pivots. And so I don't view these classifications as being hard and fast divisions, although I think, Daria, you're absolutely right that maybe these careers should belong in a different category. But the thing that I view them as being certain rhetorical, or certain types of representational modes, certain types of narrative modes that get deployed when these individuals are discussing the Holodomor. And one of the reasons why I'm interested in thinking about and looking at these texts and their different narrative modes is because not always, but oftentimes I find that when it comes to the Anglophone bystanders of the Holodomor, there's a sort of binary divisions between the two of them. There's either the heroes, Rhea Kleiman, Gareth Jones, and then there's the villains, which is everybody else. And while I agree that while I agree with Dennis that from the victim's point of view, maybe that actually is the only thing that matters, that you're either a hero or you're a perpetrator. I find that there's a much wider range of agency along a quite complicated spectrum of individuals who saw something and maybe didn't understand that one, and maybe didn't necessarily have a conceptual apparatus to make sense of this person who seemed like they were starving. And maybe they didn't initially view that one individual as being representative of a nationwide problem. They didn't view that individual as being a victim of a genocide, but at a certain point they had that realization. And so to return to John's question, individuals who believed that the Soviet Union could become an egalitarian society that would eliminate poverty, that would eliminate exploitation, who perhaps ignored evidence of the Holodomor, or didn't immediately recognize the Holodomor as such, but later did recognize it. The thing that I'm looking at, and the thing that I think is important to do, is to see what types of discourse they use to explain to make sense of their actions. And so these are the sort of classifications that I'm looking at, and which I view to be as sort of narrative modes.
Well, we don't really have much time left. There is another session beginning at 4. The questions that have come up are really about the applicability of the term bystander to the Ukrainian situation. I would just point out, and Daria, I'm sure, could speak at great length about this, that the people that we consider perpetrators not infrequently themselves would go on to starve to death. So you had perpetrators who were victims, collective farm officials. But I'm wondering, Nick, have you ever seen the memoir of Zara Witkin, an engineer? For me, after, I'm not excused, but okay, Moscow correspondence, it wasn't very, you read someone like Zara Witkin, who had local language, who was a sensitive person. He talks about the starving who had come from Ukraine being on the streets of Moscow. People had come that far to find, there were people who saw and other people walking right by not seeing it. It really pointed out his example that some people were able to see and some weren't. Yeah, so I don't know if you want to speak any more to that. And maybe, Dennis, is it possible in the Ukrainian situation that if everybody was at some risk of starving to death, if you're a city person who has rations, but very small rations, and you are hoarding, or that there could be some punishment for being seen as giving aid to peasant farmers who've been stigmatized as parasites, that it becomes a political act to help them, and that's dangerous. Maybe they're still a bystander, but we don't put such a moral judgment on it. It's still a bystander, but maybe we take some of the moral judgment out of it.
So, we can qualify people's behavior all the time. We're looking constantly for justification and self-justification, and often for good reason. Marta, you gave one good example of that. It's definitely dangerous in many cases, certainly in the cases we're talking about it, to take any step in the direction against the authorities. I think I totally get that. I would be one of those people myself. But there are strategies, right, for intervention. And if it's too risky, something we need to assess at the moment, then there is something called delegation as another strategy for for intervention, I should say, which is to say, I'm not going to be the one getting involved here, but maybe I have a connection with somebody who seems to be halfway sympathetic to what's going on. And maybe I can, let this person know that this is going on in the streets. Is there anything you can do to help, type of thing? So, and as I showed in my last slide, the reporters are simply doing their job, but they positioned themselves in a way that was not as risky to them as it could have been, and yet formed that barrier. So, yeah, we can come up with justification, and people do all the time. The question is, really, are there responsibilities? Yeah.
Oh, Marta, you're muted.
Very sorry about that. I said that we should probably call it an end here. Our next panel begins in 10 minutes at 4 o'clock Eastern time, narrating memory of the Holodomor. It promises to be a very good one. A reminder that we combined the last 2 scheduled panels. We had some people who had an unforeseen circumstance who couldn't participate in the last. So we are fortunate to have Olga Andreevsky and her discussant Bystanders participating in panel 7, narrating memory of the Holodomor, that begins shortly. And thank you all, and thank you for the fascinating presentations, and Daria for your insightful comments.